All right, everybody. Welcome to our podcast. We are the Internet World Order. My name is Austin Cook, and I'm joined by my co host, Caleb McLemore. Caleb, please say hi.
Hello, everyone.
All right. Well, welcome to the show. And we're really excited to have you guys on here. This is actually our first episode of our podcast ever. Like, this is the intro to the world.
Ever. This is a big deal. Feel privileged. If you don't feel privileged, I can't help you.
No, you. That sounds pretty bad when we put it that way. But we on this podcast we really like to talk about movies, one of our favorite things in the world, as well as wrestling, superheroes, comic books, video games, all the above. So that's what we're going to be talking about on this channel. So to start off, we wanted to talk about our favorite movies today. And my favorite movie of all time is The Dark Knight. And Caleb, please tell the people what your favorite movie is.
Yes. My favorite movie is Big Fish. And so you'll definitely have a tone shift between our two movies if you know anything about both of them.
We really like some variety on this channel, I guess you should say.
It worked out that way.
Yeah, it's perfect, but like I couldn't think of a better way for us to like actually start talking about it because what better way to define us than like talking about our favorite movies, especially like movies that defined who we are as people throughout most of our lives.
Oh, for sure.
The cool thing about it was like for Dark Knight, for me, like I know that a lot of people really love that movie. I really, really am excited to talk about it today because it's something that's very obviously been done to death by like everyone on YouTube. And like I'm film major in college, so it made sense that like, you hear that and it's like, oh, another film guy talking about the Dark Knight, like, but I'm really hoping that you guys can get a new perspective into it and, see it and appreciate it along with me as well if you do love that movie as much as I do. So I'm really excited, to be talking about it today.
Oh, for sure. I think it's been long enough now that we're kind of separated from all the memes and all the jokes that people were making back in the day to where like you can have like a whole new appreciation for it. At least that's what happened when I saw it. And I'm looking forward to seeing and hearing your thoughts on it as well.
Also, like a weird fun fact that I didn't think about when we first started talking about it. That's the first movie I've ever been to where the entire theater stood up and gave a standing ovation at the end of the show.
Oh wow. I think I've only seen that a couple of times with ever in my life. That's awesome.
Yeah, I don't really see it very often anymore. And that, that's not a knock on movies in general, but like I think that movie was just such a big deal in terms of like breaking ground and, especially with Heath Ledger, who, we're going to talk about Heath Ledger today.
How can you not?
I don't know.
He's the reason why when like the Joker movie with Walking, I can never say his name right. When that movie came out, it's the reason why they're making all the comparisons to Heath Ledger. There's a reason. And anyone that's forgotten, go rewatch this movie and you will remember that's why he's the standard still.
I know. And it's kind of like, it almost seems unfair because you're like, oh man, like no one's going to be able to follow that up. And like, it's just because it's so iconic, like no matter, like they've had so many good actors who have like taken up that role in so many different capacities. And it's just hard. Like, I love the Mark Hamill Joker personally. And I think that like he would be my all-time favorite if there was a way to like bring him to life in live action. I think that would be really cool. But I also prefer who he is as a voice actor and giving him the credit that he deserves for what he brought to the table. Because he was, I want to say, like, along with Jack Nicholson's Joker, he was one of those Jokers that like really kind of took the whole Batman series into a darker, I hate to use the word, but a darker edge.
Well, it's a phrase that hasn't aged well, but it's still accurate.
I know you get like something with a dark theme and people are like, ow, the edge.
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason why Deadpool 2, when he saw Cable, he's like, you're so dark. Are you sure you're not from DC? But it's true. Like, and I love that you brought up Mark Hamill, that in recent years, he's finally been getting the recognition he deserves. And yes, we'll get to Dark Knight. This all works together, I promise. But between him and Jack, they were able to take the Joker where he was a Saturday morning cartoon villain. And I understand, like, if we ever break down the history of comics, there's a reason why that happened, and it made total sense, but it had ran its course. And those two got it down into a darker territory, which culminated with Heath Ledger.
Exactly, and he's kind of, like, held up as the gold standard of all Jokers now, and, like, this might seem like kind of an unpopular opinion, but I personally feel like he's one of the I'm gonna say it, I think that it's one of the best performances in any medium, in any genre. I
Ooh.
was blown I know that a lot of people are gonna be like, "What? How dare you?" But, like, it's it's completely valid in my opinion, like, it's amazing, it's a performance that still holds up to this day because of just how good it was, and I think that it's completely reasonable to think that it falls into the realms of some of the best cinematic performances of all time.
Oh yeah, I mean it's the reason why he won the Oscar, uh, and why to this day, like I said, it just forever people will be compared to his performance, and it's
Which
just that's just how it is.
and it's totally not fair.
No, yeah,
Because
no, that's the downside of film is like someone goes and knocks something out of the park like that, and it's almost like it becomes a blessing and a curse. And not only is Heath Ledger's Joker like that, the entire movie has kind of done that for DC in general. But we'll get to that.
it's almost kinda like, when you're a band and you're opening for a big show and the opener just goes out there and kills it, and then they go to the back and the main guys are like, "Well, now what do we do?"
Yeah, or like in film, it's like can't remember the guy's name that made Citizen, the guy who made Citizen Kane. That was his first movie.
Oof,
How do you follow that?
you don't.
Or like how Peter O'Toole when he did Lawrence of Arabia. How do you follow that?
You don't, you can just retire, I guess.
Exactly, and it's the blessing and curse that can come with film, and so I yeah.
No,
uh,
I agree with you completely on that.
yeah, but I'm curious because I want to ask you because obviously, for those that aren't aware, there is an age gap between the two of us. So I was in high school when the movie came out, and Austin was not. And
No.
I think you said you're how old again?
I'm 23 years old, so, like, I was 11/12 when this movie came out,
Yeah, I was like
and
17. So that we saw this movie of two very different places. So I'm curious of like I said, I just want to hear like what was that like seeing as a kid?
well, it was terrifying. It was like, he's so scary. He's absolutely terrifying as just this villain who, you don't get a whole lot of backstory for him, and, we're talking about everything we're talking about the Joker mostly right now, but the thing is that he's the best part of a movie that has so many other good things going that it just amplifies what's happening in that movie. And it's so interesting when you view The Dark Knight as a movie through the lens of the Joker is the protagonist of this movie because he essentially won at the end in a weird way.
Yeah.
And I really like that he was kind of grounded in more like I was kind of expecting it. But when they had him as someone who, he puts his own makeup on and he's kind of like, I hesitate to say normal guy, but he's a character that's rooted in real world people and, what they can be like and what they're capable of. So for me, it was, I'd grown up with kind of like the Joker as like kind of this cartoon, like clowny villain. And then I watched this movie and I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is absolutely like one, it's terrifying because he's just so good at being scary. And two, it's just so I don't recognize him."
Oh yeah, no, it and if you need proof of that, go watch like a Knight's Tale
Love
and
that
then put
movie.
in The Dark Knight right after that and tell me you recognize Heath Ledger.
I still don't recognize him even like when his face paint gets smudged or like when you start to see a little bit more of like his face, like I just don't recognize him whatsoever. And it's so good.
Yeah, like the few seconds when you actually see him with no face paint on at all. You're just like, I don't know what I'm looking at.
He completely morphs into this character and he's the perfect antagonist to Batman, which a lot of people have talked about. Like, it was kind of like a well kept secret for a long time in like the comic community and the quote unquote nerd community because they would very obviously have him be the focal point of a lot of Batman's adventures in media, whether it be the comics, whether it be the Batman the animated series, which if you haven't seen, I am so sorry because it's so good.
The
And
box set's at Target and Walmart now. You don't have an excuse.
right, and it's on DC Universe, which is like $8 a month, and everyone's quarantined right now, so, like, if you're like, "Oh, I'm busy, I can't watch it. I'm like, "You're a liar," because you can watch, some of your other shows on repeat, but you can't watch something new. That's just not true
Yeah.
because and
Well,
I
break
understand, like, some people are very hesitant to give comic book movies a try because there's this unfortunate idea that comic book movies are, quote, unquote, "low art." I'm using very big, like, finger quotations right now because The
Yeah.
Dark Knight very much changed that. Like, Batman Begins was really great, but this movie just catapulted into the stratosphere. Like, it was just such a game changer for a lot of different things.
Yeah,
And
sorry, I was gonna say, like, and when you think, like, when you had Batman and Robin, and pretty much movies that justify why people looked at comics in a bad light, and then The Dark Knight just came around and just showed, "Hey, no, no, no. Here is a amazing movie that is still very much steeped in comics."
right, and I think that, like, it's still a crime that that movie didn't get nominated for Best Picture. I'm just saying, like,
Upon rewatching it, I have to agree.
it's so, like, I'm not here to, like, bash the community for, like, "Why didn't you give it a nomination?" Like, because Heath Ledger still won, so that's a huge deal. He was the first ever to win for a comic book movie, if I'm not mistaken.
I think he might have even be the first to ever be nominated, which blows my mind because 'cause there's been really good, like, Christopher Reeve and all that, Superman, but
Yeah, I'll have to look it up. I don't know for sure, but I think they might have technically had, like, Road to Perdition got some Oscar nominations, which
oh,
is
okay.
technically a graphic novel, and it's also a very good movie if you hadn't seen it, but we're talking about The Dark Knight today.
Yes.
So, back to that. I This movie specifically, like, it's not just my favorite movie, but it's the movie that convinced me to go into filmmaking. It was what changed my entire perspective on, like, the film industry and movies that were made, and after watching that movie, I was like, "I want to make something as good as that." I don't wanna make that movie, I wanna make my own movies, but this is, like, I was so inspired, and I was, like, 11, 12 years old, and I remember telling my parents, I was like, "I wanna be a filmmaker when I grow up." And they were like, "Okay." Like,
That's
you know
amazing.
Yeah, I just knew at the time, I was like, "This is what I wanna do," and, since then, I've stuck with it. I mean, it's been 12 years now? 12 years
Yeah.
since I first saw that movie?
Yeah, 12, 13 years is about, 'cause I think 2007 is when it came out.
I know. Well, the first time I ever watched it, my lower back wasn't hurting, so now we're at that point in my life where it's like all my athletic endeavors are catching up to me, and that's how you know that you're getting old. But
As he
either
says,
way,
being the young one in this podcast.
I know, but 6 years of wrestling will do that to you. Like,
Fair, fair.
you're like, "I'm in the best shape of my life," and then you get up and your knees creak, and you're like,
Mm.
I don't know about that anymore."
Fair enough.
And yeah, it's that movie changed a lot for me because it was proof that the things that I had liked because I was already into comics at that point, like, I'd grown up watching Teen Titans and Justice League Unlimited and the old Justice League series, Superman the animated series, and being able to see that, but having it be put on the pedestal that it absolutely deserved to be put on is just like it was huge for me because I was like, this can be amazing. And like people I know who kind of like, because this was around the same time where comic book movies were either up and down. Like you had the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, which a lot of people love, myself included. And then you had other movies that weren't quite as well received and people don't generally hold them up to like this is an Oscar caliber movie, and this movie just came out and everyone was like, "Oh, we're wrong. Like,
Yeah,
we're
I mean,
100% wrong."
yeah, and then you'd have a couple of movies come out that go well because you'd like, yeah, it's same. So you're talking about the Sam Raimi Spider-Man's, like you'd have Spider-Man 1 and 2, great. Spider-Man 3, eh. Then you have X-Men 1 and 2, great. X3, eh. So you just kind of kept having this back and forth to where like you're saying, there was peaks and valleys, and
Yeah,
it was kind of nuts. You didn't know what you were going to get when you went to go see the movie.
because it was literally, if I'm not mistaken, it was 2 months before no, it was 2 months after the MCU had kind of unofficially started, because Iron Man came out, like, right before that.
I'm well, I already said I'm not going to be googling stuff, so I'm just going to go with what you said. Yes.
I remember specifically that it was Iron Man came out, like, right before that because Iron Man was 2008, and I
Yes.
think that, like, it did really well like it should have because Iron Man was really, really awesome. And
Mhm.
then you watch The Dark Knight, which is, like you're talking about 2 very different movies because, like, they tackle like, tough topics in today and, like, weaponry and, like, military and, modern day hot topics that we're not necessarily gonna go into on this podcast. But,
No.
it was one of the first movies where it was like, you were watching a superhero movie while also getting, like, imagery that, like, evoked 9/11 in a way
Yes.
that was, like, not traumatic, but you're just like, "Whoa." Like, it's so like, that scene of him of Batman in the ruins of that building was just so, like, haunting,
Mhm.
so scary without being, like, overly, like, edgy. Like, it was just powerful.
Yeah, and I think that's the difference is, like, it wasn't trying too hard. It wasn't, like, I don't know, it's like it's not like it threw in, like, random gore, like, cursing or something, like, cough, Blade Trinity, cough, uh, and doing bad things like that. It understood where to be dark and when to pull back a little bit.
Exactly, and I think that well, for a lot of people, that movie scarred quite a few people because 'cause they're like, "Oh, it's a superhero movie, like, I can go into it like I did with Iron Man." And, like, I might have to explain a couple things to him, and then Heath Ledger came on screen, and they're like, "Oh, I'm so screwed as a parent." Like
Oh, yeah, no, no, no. I still think to this day, and I've seen people put, do their videos on it. That initial scene with Joker, not the bank robbery, the scene when he's with all the gang leaders, be the perfect way to introduce the Joker.
Yeah, that was scary. The whole theater I was in, like, when he did the pencil trick, everyone was like, "Ooh!" And
Yeah.
yeah, I was like, "Oh my gosh, like, what is the"
That's the moment you knew this is different.
This is not a typical superhero movie, and that, like I knew that the movie was gonna be good from the beginning just because I was so excited about it and I could feel it,
Yeah.
but that just kinda transcended it. It was like, "Oh, you better buckle up, buddy. You better
And
you
it
better get
starts
real ready."
high and it just keeps going. That's what makes it so good.
And it just gets better and better. Like, I keep lathering like, praise on this movie because, like, it's so funny watching the difference between, like, the fight scenes in this movie and then the fight scenes in Batman Begins because you could tell that it's, like, Christopher Nolan is a very, like, big visual, like, epic filmmaker, and that's why, Dunkirk was better seen on, like, 70 millimeter, like, because he loves capturing these epic moments on the widest scale possible, and it's very evocative of, like, Stanley Kubrick. And you watch Batman Begins, and there's so much, like, cutting in the fight scenes, and, like, every once in a while, you'll just kinda, like, see guys in the back who are, like, dancing in the back, like, like, trying to, like trying to get in on the fight, but they're not really there. And there's a couple times, like, I don't know if it's specifically in Dark Knight, but definitely in Dark Knight Rises where, like, you see a guy in the background who runs forward and then gets hit by nothing and he falls over. Like, you notice it and you're like, I'm not gonna say anything, but I definitely did just see that. It's so
That's the movie version of a pro wrestling botch.
it's like the Wilhelm scream, but it's less noticeable because they still use the Wilhelm scream for some reason.
Because it works. It's like duct tape.
I know, but, like, I remember when they had it in Man of Steel, like, this movie that was, like, so, like, it was a little on the darker side, not in, like, it was graphic or gory, but, like, it was very intense. And
Mhm.
there's a scene where a guy gets thrown off of the plane, and then he just goes, "Woo!" And I was like, that felt so out of place for this whole movie.
Well, to go in the comment, like, to kinda, because 'cause I'm just curious, because with this being your favorite movie, I'm curious of your thoughts of, like, I think upon rewatching it, because obviously, because it had been years since I had seen it last, so one of the things that I always liked when I'd watch it, but I guess seeing it at this point in my life, I have a real appreciation for is the chemistry that Christian Bale and, Michael Caine have as, Bruce and Alfred.
Oh, it's
Uh
wonderful.
Exactly. It's like, to me, as great as Heath Ledger is, it's like I almost want to put their chemistry like right there next to Heath Ledger's performance.
It's very natural and, like, I mean, it's Michael Caine, so you're always gonna get, like, a really good performance out of it, but the way that they kinda play off each other and the sarcasm that's laden throughout, like, Michael Caine's entire, like, when he delivers monologues or, like, when he
Mhm.
delivers, like, snappy one-liners to Bruce, it's like they're old friends, which is perfect because that's exactly what they should be.
Yeah, like when they're
He's his
walking
father
toward,
figure.
exactly, like when, Bruce was thinking he was about to go give himself up as Batman, and they're shutting down the Batcave, and they're walking through. He goes, "Well, Alfred, you can now say I told you so." He goes, "Well, I don't want to." And they walk. He goes, but I bloody did tell you so. I was
Really
like,
don't
I
want to,
love
but
it.
I'm going to. Yeah. I love that about it. And Michael Caine's really perfect in that role. Like, I know that like we've gone through many Alfreds over the years, and
Hmm.
oftentimes it's like the cool thing with Alfred is you'll get actors who are very like seasoned actors. Like I know that like Jeremy Irons when he was announced as Alfred, I was like, "Oh, this is going to be."
Oh yeah, phenomenal actor, perfect.
Andy Serkis is the new one
Yeah,
with
another one, perfect.
Battinson,
God dang it.
Patman, which I'm
Ye-
really excited for.
Okay, actually, I can get behind Pat Man. I can, I can go for that one.
Patman and Battinson, it's going to work.
Oh, of course, it's gonna work. He spent a decade playing a moody vampire. It's like he was
Yes.
preparing for this.
Oh, it's true. Well, also, like, if you watch some of his indie movies, like, especially, like, what he did with, the Safdie brothers, it's just so like, Good Time. It's so good.
Yeah.
He's so versatile, and he's so intense, and I just
Well,
love watching what he does because, honestly, he's kind of a joy to watch, and he's kind of a perfect fit for Bruce Wayne.
yeah. I mean, we'll talk about probably in another episode, but for sure, I'm all aboard the let's forgive him for Twilight because not even he liked filming Twilight. So let's
Yeah, you
let the
can
man have a
only
break.
I mean, people were all on Michael Keaton's case, too, when he was Batman. They're like, "Oh, well, he's primarily a comedic actor," and then he ended up being awesome.
Yeah. Or I mean, shoot, it's like since we're talking about with the Dark Knight, when Heath Ledger first got announced as the Joker, a joke that I thought was hilarious, but kind of tells you, and I was like, why are they doing Heath Ledger? You might as well call this movie Brokeback Batman.
Oof.
Which, yes, it's hilarious because I'm a sucker for alliteration. But then he goes out there and obviously, like you've already heard us talk for a while about how great it is. So let's just give people a chance.
Yeah,
But
it's always give people a chance, especially, like because people are like, "Oh, yeah, how to lose a Batman in 10 days." They had,
oh
like,
yeah,
this
that's
whole
true.
spiel that they were giving him, and I am so glad that not only did he go above and beyond, but he literally proved everyone wrong.
So I guess kind of like as before we get rabbit trail onto Patman, what are your thoughts? I'm curious, like what your thoughts on like what two like how they handle Two Face.
It was brilliant. I think that it was perfect. I wish I could have seen a little bit more of him, like, in the future, but it was also, like, in terms of the overall story, it was the perfect way to have his story arc complete.
Hmm.
And, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen The Dark Knight,
It's a 13-year-old movie. Come on now.
it's from years and years ago. If you haven't seen it yet, then just
It's
kinda
on.
skip over a couple minutes. But Two-Face essentially dies at the end, and it's, because Batman saves, Gordon's family and, Two-Face falls to his death, and it's the perfect story arc for him to set up this entire redemption for Batman as a whole in the future movies, and essentially the Joker won in the end, which is crazy, like, because you don't often see something like that in movies where it's like, "Oh, yeah, like, the bad guy, like, kind of wins or the bad guy has a point." It's like, no, he didn't necessarily have a point, he was just so entrenched in his belief, and he's the perfect counter to everything that Batman stood for, which is basically, like, in the long run, you kinda see it, like, as the development of the Patriot Act, I guess,
In a lot of ways, yeah.
and you see him just countering that and bringing chaos in a way where it's like, you don't even agree with him, you don't even sympathize with him. He's pure evil, but you understand his motivations in a way that's perfect and how he eventually forces Batman to change for the better because Batman was I wanna say wrong, he was wrong. Batman was wrong.
Oh no, there's a reason why Lucius Fox like gives him the verbal smackdown of like, this is terrible what you're doing now.
Right, they had to go above and beyond and invade people's privacy and do things that weren't necessarily heroic in order to win, and in the end, they still didn't win because they became opposed to what they originally stood for,
Yeah.
and he proved that they were wrong, but he also forced them to change for the better. And I
Yeah.
think that that's brilliant storytelling because it goes beyond like we can heap praise on, Christopher Nolan and Heath Ledger all day, but like Jonathan Nolan helped make this movie what it was in that regard. He really took a lot of this story arc and just made it so not only like applicable to everything going on in the world climate, but he made it applicable to just basic human storytelling in moral ideology. and how what is good and what is right in this world, what is wrong, and when do we cross the line into wrong because we're trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, it's like that phrase of the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Exactly. That was, I don't know why I didn't think of that.
It's cool. That's why there's two of us.
That, yeah, if I was doing this alone, I'd be screwed. But
Yeah, but I get what I understand what you're saying. It's like you have a villain like Joker didn't ultimately win because his ultimate goal was he wanted to basically create, I guess you could almost say like super villain, like true like actual super villains with himself and Two Face, and it didn't quite work out that way. But he also didn't lose.
yeah, it's everything didn't go according to plan, but I mean, he's an agent of chaos and he essentially had almost complete control over the entire situation.
Yeah,
And with Harvey, like, oh, one of my favorite scenes in the movie, like, first of all, it's hilarious because when he's trying to when Harvey's in the hospital and he shows up in the nurse outfit and he takes his mask off and Harvey doesn't realize who he is until he takes the
that was.
mask
It's
off.
always been a weird moment. Even when I rewatched it, I'm like, what?
He's just like looking at him and then he takes it off and it's like, how did you not know exactly who
Yeah,
he
how'd you not piece that
was?
together?
Like he's looking at him, he's like, oh, my nurse with the wig and the eye makeup again.
A
That's
nurse
one of
that
my
looks strange
favorite parts.
masculine.
Right. He's like, huh, that kind of looks like the Joker. Whatever. That's not a big deal.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder if that's a situation of maybe that was like a longer scene or something, and they had to edit it down, and it would have made more sense if you saw the full thing.
Right. Like it didn't hamper, my enjoyment of the movie, but like
Well, absolutely not.
looking back on it now, I'm like, that's hilarious because I didn't catch that the first time because it was so good. And that scene in particular where he essentially turns Harvey to the dark side and he gives him the gun and he has it in his hand. One of those small details that I noticed is that he had his hand on the hammer. So if Harvey pulled the trigger, the gun wasn't going to fire.
That's true. I didn't think about that. Good point.
He had complete control over the situation. It's the illusion of choice, which is so brilliant
Yeah,
because he gave Harvey what he wanted, which was choice and fairness in his own mind, while also completely controlling that situation. No matter what Harvey did, he was going to walk out of there victor,
yeah. Like to have, like as he put it later, to have his ace in the hole.
which is Harvey Dent. Sounds so weird when you say it like that. But also, let's talk about like Aaron Eckhart did such a great job with portraying Two-Face and how Two-Face was,
Oh my
especially like
gosh, yes.
comic accurate, because
Hmm.
Two-Face is known as the villain that started off as the guy who was doing the right thing, so he was a perfect choice for it. But the way that Two-Face and Harvey Dent plays off of Christian Bale in this movie is just so good too. It's
Hmm.
so like because you can see them agreeing on what they need to do, but ultimately never agreeing on how to do it.
Yes, and that dichotomy is just. I mean, not just with Christian or with Bruce Wayne, but like how Harvey Dent brushed up against Gordon, how he brushed up against the mayor, because it's like he almost had this. I mean, geez, it was almost Superman esque of how he's like, "We're the good guys. The good guys lock up the bad guys. It's that simple." And they're like, "No, it's not."
It's never that simple. And like, that one of the funny things about like the original like Batman Begins is they have the scene where it's like he goes down and like he's in like the underworld where like the judges are hanging out with like the Falcone or the Carmoni families and like they're like hanging out down there and it's like they're filling our streets with crime and corrupting our youths with drugs. And it's so funny because it's like it's kind of heavy-handed but it's also perfect for like the series and what they stand for because in the beginning it's like this hopeful like he went from being this angry person to being I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to follow this rule and the one rule that Batman always follows throughout this series in particular is that he doesn't kill people. Like he doesn't commit murder
He'll
in order
beat you within an inch of your life, but he will not kill you.
No, he won't kill you.
No.
No, one more punch would kill you and that would be wrong.
If you don't know what we're talking about, just look up Robot Chicken and it'll all make sense.
It's amazing. And then the Joker's like, that somehow means I win. You won't kill me. I won. And it's just this funny back and forth. And I I really love Christian Bale as Batman. It's
Yes.
so good. And it's something that kind of set the bar for me that future Batmans kind of had to live up to, which I mean, thankfully, I don't think we've ever had a Batman that I've been like, he is not fit to be Batman.
The
I've always
closest we got was it got lit. Like they really tested the waters with George Clooney and Val
yeah,
Kilmer.
but even then, it's like they had the characteristics to make it
Oh no,
accurate to what Bruce Wayne is. I kind of like that. It's
the
just
fault wasn't their fault. It was the fault of the writing and directing.
right, and
So
I
I get
think
what
that
you're saying. Yeah, I agree.
they look back on it now and like, they can acknowledge it and kind of be like, yeah, like it wasn't my best work. And, if I could have done things differently, I would. And we've always kind of been lucky in that regard because I don't think there's a Batman that I've been like, that is not Batman. I've watched it. I've
Exactly.
been like, even to an extent, I'm like, there's always some bit of Batman in the characters they choose. And they've always done a really good job of choosing that. Christian
Yeah.
Bale is right up at the top with some of my favorite Batman characters of all time. And you're noticing
Yeah.
that I'm not saying he's the best, which doesn't mean that he's, not very, very close because I'm kind of back and forth on a lot of the characters of like who's portrayed Batman and how I feel about him because they all bring something really cool to the table.
And
I also
that's what makes the character endearing too, is because you can do that.
exactly, and he's human. He doesn't have any superpowers except being rich. Joke from
Yes.
Justice League, but
And it's also true.
it's so true. It's like you can't. People are like, "Well, I could become Batman." It's like, no, you couldn't.
You
Like,
have to have the net worth of a small country.
you have to be one of the richest men in the world in order to become Batman, and even then, you probably couldn't become Batman because your human body can only take so much of a beating. Which I'm
Yeah.
really glad they touched on, especially like beginning with this movie. Because in the first movie, it was brand new, like he was just starting. But in the Dark Knight, like it introduced the idea that Batman is not invincible. Like he
Yes.
had all those bruises, he had all those bumps and cracked ribs, and he was messed up. Like for lack of a better way to put it, like he was kind of effed up.
Yeah.
And I'm
Oh.
glad that they showed that because it made him feel more human to what Batman should be. Like a lot of times now, like we can kind of look at Batman in series and just go like, oh, he's unstoppable. Like he literally
Yeah.
just beat up Superman, which
Yeah.
can happen. Don't get me wrong, but
No, I know what you're saying. Like, and a lot of superheroes nowadays, like you might see them to get like a little bloody or like, especially like let's take like the Avengers movies. Like they'll get beaten up and be bloody and give it like 10 minutes and somehow they're miraculously healed because I guess they can heal like Wolverine. Dark
that's
Knight was
true.
like, no, these are scars he got maybe weeks ago, maybe months ago.
I was thinking about like in Justice League, like with him, like that was the first time we kind of just like started to see Batman like get messed up in that universe where it's like he would take hits because in Batman versus Superman, like he'd get thrown around in the suit and then just deliver some kickboxing maneuvers, like
Yeah. And
the
that's
whole
some,
warehouse fight. And then in Justice League, you're like, oh wait, like he got tossed around by Superman a little bit, like because he wasn't defending himself at all. And you could see like they had to like pop his shoulders back in and he's all messed up. And I was like, that's almost a better way to portray the character because it makes me feel like he's more vulnerable.
yeah. And you're cheering for him more because you're like, oh, he can die.
Oh, he absolutely can die, and he's kind of like the Iron Man of the DC universe in a way. Like they're very different. They have their own merits, but something about Batman makes him more relatable in the regard of like, well, he can just get shot like offhandedly, and then that's it.
Yeah. So it's like, obviously, with it being a comic book movie, like the good guy's going to win, but you're just like, but because he's human, you have that moment of, oh, he might not. Because, like you said, just one bullet, and that's all it needs.
That's all it's gonna take, and he for all of his money and for all of his worth, it's like he has to put himself in a position to try and do the right thing. And it almost kind of scares me because it's like Superman can do that, but he's also Superman.
Exactly.
Like all the firepower in the world can't take down Superman. He has very specific weaknesses. But one of the big things about, Bruce Wayne is that Bruce Wayne is Batman? Wait,
Right.
Bruce Wayne is Batman. And he's so I just realized that, guys.
I, I didn't think I could ever piece it together,
Who would
but
have thought?
I mean, who else could afford to be Batman?
I know because it's hard to make him super super relatable for just his regular character because the billionaire, he has
Yeah.
everything going for him in the world, but the choices he makes and how he puts himself on the line because of those choices, I think is fascinating.
Yeah. It's like that, a meme I saw years ago, but it's true. Like when people say, like, why do they like Batman? He goes, he's literally the 1%, but he's fighting for the 99.
Exactly. He's white privilege that's using his white privilege to fight for the good of everyone around him, which is really like I can't remember where I read that, but I was cracking up because I was like, "That's a great way to put it." Like
It's not bad, but I mean, because it's like you're saying, like Bruce Wayne, the character himself, is not very relatable. I mean, it's like that moment in the very first Avengers movie when Steve Rogers looks at Iron Man, and goes, "Take away the suit, and what are you?" He goes, "Billionaire, playboy, philanthropist." That's exactly what Bruce Wayne could say.
exactly. He's kind of the same, except not as like his entire Bruce Wayne persona is a complete facade because he incorporates this changed person into Batman, and that's who he is underneath all of that. Because I mean, people like this is gonna sound so cheesy, but they're like, "Oh, Batman is who he actually is. Bruce Wayne is the real mask." And I was like, "No, he's Bruce Wayne.
Oh, he's absolutely Bruce Wayne.
He's just pretending to be something other than what he actually is because otherwise people would lose hope in Batman because he knows that you can't rally around a billionaire who
Yeah,
can only throw money at certain things. Like he actually like takes vigilante justice into his own hands, and oh,
yeah.
that's so cool. It's also not possible, but it's so
Oh,
cool.
exactly. It's like let's just talk about like because if you ever had a comic book accurate Batman, that means he has to have like 10 PhDs, and yet at the same time is a master in like every martial arts ever invented and a few that were made up.
And
And
has all
he
these
still,
social skills and like
yeah, he
can
can
talk
get
to
any
people.
man or woman that he wanted because he's that smooth. And he has the time to still keep up that bot to still keep up the shredded body that he has.
It's just not possible. Like
So it's like, but that's part of what I mean. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's part of what I think from what I'm hearing from you is that like they found a way to take the ridiculousness of when you really look at the comic book Batman of like as great as he is, it is ridiculous, but they found a way to frame it in a way that's realistic and grounded.
yeah, I felt like I was watching a real character and like watching him struggle to fight dogs. Like that makes
Yes.
so much sense. Like he doesn't just like deflect him with like a force field or some random like gadget that he has in his belt, much like the original Batman, the Adam West Batman, which I love that. I think that's hilarious, but it also
It's
doesn't
great
make
in its
any
own
sense.
right.
He pulls out the dog repellent spray, and it's like, "Where did you get that?" And he's like, "I'm Batman."
No, you mean the shark repellent spray that worked on the shark and it exploded, but it was a robotic shark, so it shouldn't have worked, but it did anyway?
Right, and it was hilarious, but it's just like, if you tried to, like, apply that to The Dark Knight and it's like him, he's like, "Oh, I'm struggling, this dog's biting me, don't worry." Like, I have the perfect solution to this because I'm Batman and I thought everything out, like,
Yeah,
it's just so funny to, like, think about. I love the groundedness of this in a way that, like, it can't be replicated with those other superheroes.
right. No, that I agree with you on that. That is I mean, it's like, the big fight when he's working his way up the, stories to get the Joker, and he deals with all the henchmen and the thugs, but then he still struggles with the dogs.
I know,
And
and
it's
one of
like, yeah,
the
he's been trained on how to fight people, not animals.
and animals are like dogs are gnarly.
Yeah.
Like they're wild animals, and one of the interesting things, like now that we're bringing it up, is like he's so strong and he's known for like all of his strength and what he can do to criminals. Like they're all afraid of him because he can break all their bones. And the thing about the Joker that just makes him even more interesting of a villain is the fact that he doesn't care if you physically beat him up because it means nothing to him.
Yeah,
Like, and he even quotes that in the interrogation scene, which is so good.
it is.
Oh my gosh, it's amazing. When he's like, "You have nothing to threaten me with, all your strength, and you still can't touch me on this because it's not like it doesn't affect me." And
Yeah.
that was just brilliant because it's like Superman and Lex Luthor, where it's like Superman has all the strength in the world and he's smart as well, but Lex Luthor is even smarter. He's even more brilliant.
Yeah,
And
and
it's
he's conniving, so it's like you can't he's so well connected, it's like, if you go after me, it's like it's almost like you're going after America sort of thing.
right. To look at it, in one perspective, like he's kind of Superman in the way of like his brains make him a Superman, but
Yeah.
he's also evil in a
Yes.
way that's very, very interesting. And I love that about the Joker too, because it's like obviously it's a little smaller scale, but you have someone who's brilliant and has all this strength and all this power, but they're not evil like the Joker is.
Yes.
And they
I
very well could be. That like one day could change everything. And I'm quoting the Killing Joke unintentionally, but that had a huge impact on everything that has inspired Batman media today. You can't watch anything with a Joker and not be like, Killing Joke.
Yeah, the 2 comics is The Dark Knight Returns and The Killing Joke. Basically, everything that's happened in the last 30 years is because of those 2 comics.
That and I think with this movie was The Long Halloween was a huge, huge, like, influence on this story, especially with
Yeah.
Two-Face and everything he did.
Yeah, I think they even said, like, someone I will never know if this is true or not because I told it at a comic shop, so the guy might have told me this just to sell the comic. But, he was like, when he handed me The Killing Joke, I was, "I've heard about this. Why should I read it?" He goes, "It's what they gave Heath Ledger when they told him to study the Joker." I went,
I'd like to
"Oh,
believe that. It's probably true because they always give them material to look up when they're, like, preparing for the role, and
yeah."
the cool thing about superhero movies is, like, it's always there. Like, you have a
Mhm.
big library of stuff, and it's like that's why it's technically, like, adapted material, but it's stuff that you can draw from to create your own story, and the cool thing about that is, like, the comic book movie doesn't have the constraints of it has to follow the specific storyline. It's not like a book where if you change it too much, it changes the entire story. Like,
Exactly.
you're adapting characters into, like, elements of the storylines that made them great while focusing specifically on those characters, and they
Yeah.
nailed Batman in that regard because, Christopher Nolan's just so like, I remember, like, this movie was when they kinda started playing around with like, the IMAX change, like, the aspect ratio change, where there was, like, noticeable bars on the screen, and then you would watch it, and it would change, like, the frame. You'd be like, "Whoa!" Like like
Yeah, that's true, I didn't think about that. Good point.
yeah, it didn't affect me when I first watched it, but as I got older and I started learning film, like, theory at UC, I was like, "Oh, like, that's very noticeable now."
Yeah.
Like, it's not a bad thing, but it also adds some extra weight to the scenes where it really does come to use, like, when he's in Hong Kong and he's on top of that building and it switches to IMAX, you're like, "Oh my gosh." Like,
Yeah.
that is dizzying to look at. Like, I have a 32-inch TV in my room, and I showed my girlfriend The Dark Knight recently, and she was watching it, and she's like, "Ah," like, just
It takes you
watching
off
that
guard if you're not
shot.
expecting it.
Yeah, you're just looking at it, and you're like, "I would never do that," and it's like, "Well, yeah, you're not Batman." So, no one's Batman, and I can't think of anyone who'd be like, "Yeah, I'll just dive off of this roof and then somehow get connected to a balloon on a plane and fly away and not pee myself in the process."
Yeah, just, kidnap a Chinese national and not cause a world war.
This is also Batman we're talking
No,
about.
no, that's not me nitpicking, it's just it's part of the ridiculousness of why people like Batman.
Right, he can do whatever he wants. They're like, he has no jurisdiction, which is true because he's I mean, if we're really looking at it in a technical way, he has so many crimes that he could
Oh,
be
yeah.
convicted of.
He'd have, like I for those of y'all that are familiar, like, with if you know, like, Suicide Squad of, like, they get brought into the team because they have multiple life sentences. Batman would have more life sentences than the entire Suicide Squad combined.
Vigilante justice is very much like I mean, not a whole lot of people do it because, well, they're not Batman, but it's also like, you'll die. Like,
Yeah.
it's you'll die and, like, he just has such a high, like, crime count, but, like, Gotham's such, like, a crime-infested city.
Yeah.
It's like 85% of Gotham gets murdered in a year. Like, that's not true, but,
It
like,
feels like it.
it's like everyone is constantly dying in Gotham.
I mean, geez, what if you when you see some of the, like, arc after arc that happens in comics, you're just like, "I'm pretty sure 2,000,000 people just died in the span of, like, a month."
It almost feels like the superheroes make it worse.
And that's actually
Like
one of the things Dark Knight talked about.
which is yeah, it's true. It's like there wasn't a Joker before Batman came around.
Yeah,
And
you just had the mafia and that's it.
right, and it's dude, it's just so scary because he scared the mafia, and then the Joker, who's far worse than all the mafia combined, is like he just completely shook up everything. And then you have Bane,
Yes.
who in the next movie, which we'll talk about The Dark Knight Rises in a later episode, like more thoroughly and more thoughtfully. But he's scary on a different level because he's entirely Batman while also being stronger than he in almost
Yeah.
every regard. So like
Mhm.
whatever the Joker lacks in physicality, Bane more than makes up for. And it's
And I
just so interesting to watch.
oh, for sure, and I will always I know some people obviously because the Dark Knight set such a high standard, the Dark Knight Rises was kind of doomed to not meet that standard. But I will always thank the Nolan brothers for
Oh,
redeeming Bane after what Batman and Robin did to him.
well, right. They made him like the design of him was kind of cool. Like I know that it's going to be like blasphemous to say like, yeah, I kind of like something from that movie. It was like his design was mildly interesting, and everyone's like,
I mean, it is, but
but they also made him like a bumbling oaf who would just like roar.
that's literally his only line is in the whole movie, and it's
He just roars and like throws fake punches, and you're just like, oh
yeah.
my
The
gosh, that's not Bane.
only well was making him comic book accurate of a scrawny guy that turns into a giant brick house of
Well,
muscle.
he's not even scrawny like initially. He just puts on all that weight, and then the venom makes him even more scary. And
Yeah,
you're like, I don't want to fight that guy.
exactly, and I'm fine with that. But like, yeah, but then like I said, Dark Knight Rises kind of like showed you like, no, Bane's a big deal. Here's why.
So scary. I love it.
And
But
I
back to like the Dark Knight, like it's just so like watching that transition of like, you have different characters. Like you had Ra's al Ghul in the first one, and he's great. Liam Neeson's great in that role. I love that Ra's al Ghul, and I was initially a little hesitant when I heard it was Ra's al Ghul because I was like, can't he just like come back to life?
yeah,
And then they incorporate it in a way that I was very like, okay. Like I don't have to worry about like mystical stuff in this very like realistic grounded Batman movie.
yeah. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little worried about that too because it's like you can't have both.
Yeah, and they found a way to make it work really well, and I'm very pleased about that. And to this day, I think that it set a really good standard for like Batman villains because they've always been some of the more highly regarded villains in comic book like lore and history. Like everyone either looks at like Spider-Man villains or they look at Batman villains. And there's a
Yep.
lot of others like and that's just in mainstream media. Like obviously like if you're super into comics, you're going to watch all of these other movies and you'll be like, "Well, Superman has great villains too," which he totally does.
Yeah.
And Green Lantern has great villains too. It's just so there's such a deeply rooted, interesting thing about what Batman villains do, and that's
Yeah. I mean,
they challenge Batman in ways that are specific to his character, and they do it so well. Like a lot of great villains do that, but the way that his villains do it are just iconic. It's so amazing.
exactly. There's a reason why they've endured for literally 80, anywhere from depending on when they got made, 50 to 80 years.
Yeah, he's
Uh,
been around since the 40s.
exactly. I mean, it's like because like Two Face is like everyone always says like Joker is Batman's greatest mistake. No, that's Two Face
Yeah,
because he could
Two
have
Face was
prevented Two Face. Joker was already too far gone.
yeah, Joker was the antithesis of everything that he is. Harvey Dent was what he kind of aspired to be in the eyes of the public, but
Yeah.
was ultimately unable to save because even he was corruptible. Because
Yes.
he was not perfect. He wasn't what the public saw him as. And, them trying to protect that was, like protecting a lie.
Yes.
And I mean, like if you've all seen the movie too, you're probably just like you're literally just reciting the plot to me.
But you don't understand. It's so good.
It's just so good. Just listen to me, okay?
If you're
If you
still
haven't
listening now, then you're in. You're okay. Just let us have this.
you're in. Please let me have this, okay? I love it. It's a movie that I can watch, like there's not a movie I watch every single day just because, that's incredibly difficult to do, but it's a movie that I can watch frequently all the time that always just gets better for me. There's always some new small thing about it that I can appreciate, that I can fall more in love with, and it still reminds me why I started film in the first place. So like that's why it's my favorite.
Yeah. No, and to guess put a nice little bow for myself. Like it's been great to come back and watch this because, as I alluded to at the beginning, anyone that was watching it back when it first came out, we're all aware of all of like people poking fun at Christian Bale's Batman voice of sounding like the love child of Clint Eastwood and a grizzly bear.
This
Uh,
isn't a car.
exactly. Uh, why do you want to kill me? But now that we're years apart, years away from that, those memes are long dead, and I could almost watch it for like almost like for the first time in a way. Like it kind of gave a whole new appreciation to like just really enjoy it. And so I'm glad that we were able to talk about this in long form. And I completely understand why it's your favorite movie.
Well, I'm glad you do understand. It's it was a big part of my childhood, and I actually watched the Tim Burton one right around the same time. I think my parents finally let me watch it because they're like, yeah, you know what, like he's getting to that point where he can start watching stuff like PG-13 movies that we normally wouldn't let him watch.
Yeah, old enough
And
to where you'd be fine.
right, and that's when I started actually like around that time was when Blockbuster was still around, and there was a movie that because I had The Dark Knight on like DVD, like my family got it on DVD. They're like, we're just gonna buy this movie. I didn't have to worry about that. But a movie that I wasn't fully aware of when I was a kid because I just hadn't had the chance to watch it was Big Fish, which incidentally is your favorite movie that we're going to talk about today. I rewatched that again, and oh my gosh, it's so good.
Oh, I I am trying to think of like how to just where to even start because that movie just it there's obviously like the acting and the cinematography and I love the way that especially when they're in the memories, like the way the lighting's done versus when they're in the present day. There's all sorts of things like that. But ultimately what it boils down to for me is that with Big Fish, and for those of y'all wondering, if you ever watch the movies, if you watch Dark Knight and Big Fish back to back, I'm gonna worry about your mental sanity just because of how big of a shift in tone that is.
They're
But
both incredibly like emotional movies in different ways, so you're just kind of bouncing all back and forth.
yeah, uh, if you do it while you're in quarantine right now, that means it's getting to. But um, ultimately, it boils down to because like the beginning of the movie when when the son uh, says that his father has always just told these tall tales, and it's impossible to separate the myth from the reality. So the easiest way to tell his life story is just to say it exactly as he always told it. And for me, I just relate to that on a very, very sentimental level because my dad has always been a big storyteller. If you ask him about like what college was like, what various adventures he went through when he was working in at Albertsons, which is a grocery store chain that is pretty much all but gone at this point. So for those
There's
wondering,
there's still one in my hometown actually, in
I said
Ramona.
almost gone, but
Yeah,
yes,
it's still staying strong. Like everyone would go to like Stater Brothers, but like Albertsons never quit, and I
exactly.
I love that it's still there.
No, I when I would live when I lived for California in a few years, for a few years I would go by Albertsons every so often just for the little like feel like a kid again. Uh, but he would tell these stories, and you swear 75% like you're like no that it did not happen like that. There's no way what you're telling me is true, and then you find out that's how it happened. He exaggerated some of the details, but that's essentially what happened. That's where I relate to Big Fish so much of like the father and son dynamic. And just for disclaimer, in case I have family or friends that end up listening to this, my dad and I are basically like best friends at this point. We're good. I don't have this strained relationship like in that movie, but just I understand that dynamic of you have this, you have a father figure that casts a very long shadow because he's very sociable, very personable, and just tells these amazing stories that people kind of just sit and listen to. And you kind of feel like you're always having to live up to that. So that's why that movie's always resonated with me on a deep personal level. On that and the fact that I am a mark for, and I'm probably going to say his name wrong, but I have a complete mark for Aaron McGregor. I will watch anything he's in.
Yeah,
And
Ewan McGregor is amazing, and I liked watching this movie because Billy Crudup, like as one of the co-leads in the movie, I was like, oh, it's kind of like like Doctor Manhattan and Obi-Wan Kenobi, like their origin stories. Like for anyone who doesn't know, like Billy Crudup played Doctor Manhattan in the Watchmen movie, and
that's
then
right.
because everyone forgets that, because everyone knows that Ewan McGregor was very clearly like Obi-Wan Kenobi, but it's just so funny when you like put him in a movie and you're like, who's gonna win?
That's true. Fair enough. Uh, yeah, it's kind of like we like watching The Dark Knight. The anchor for Gotham City News is the guy who plays Howard in Better Call Saul now. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. But uh, but yeah, like just with Big Fish, it's just it's very whimsical, very fantasy. I know for a lot of people, you wouldn't think Tim Burton would do that because it's like you're sitting there watching it and it has like this the music is perfect for the scenes, and you're just sitting there like, this is the same guy that made Beetlejuice and the 1989 Batman and Sweeney Todd and Edward Scissorhands. Like, it's the same. It's like, yes. And it's just for me, it just kind of like it wraps me up. And then it's one of those movies where like you can kind of get just lost and immersed in. And Big Fish feels that for me every time. Because like I said, it's just you have, especially because it's like my dad being uh with his various jobs throughout his life, and especially since he is like a pastor now and stuff. So like he talks to people and has to relate to them and be sociable and uh talk in a way that they will listen. And I, being an actor and I do write, it's like I just see a lot of parallels with the Edward and his son, and between my dad and me. And that's not even getting into just how much I just love the crazy stories when you're like, the little kids go see the witch and what happens to them. And of course the love story is fantastic, how Edward wins over Sandra. It's cheesy, and some of you, I don't know like what your tolerance for like cheesy romance stuff is. You might sit there and start, wanting to go gag with how it handles itself, but I think it's brilliant and it's beautiful, and it's hard for me not to have a tear in my eye when I'm watching all of it.
I'm gonna be honest with you. That was like the one part of the movie where I was like, when I was watching, I was like, that's borderline stalking
I
almost.
know,
Like,
I know.
I hate to call it out as that, but like when I was watching it, I was like, he's kind of stalking her a little
No,
bit.
I know. I know it follows a lot of romantic tropes.
Mhm.
And a lot of romantic tropes, when you break them down, kind of don't look so good when you examine them closely.
Speaking of tropes too, there's some parts of this movie that I don't think aged quite well. And like the whole North Korea stuff, I was like, oh yikes.
Well, that was
Oh.
well, that was you mean was that supposed to be North? I thought that was supposed to be like Japan.
No, it was I thought it was initially too, but he actually got drafted for the Korean War.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I mistook that then.
I was thinking of the time frame and I was like, "Oh, if this is like the '40s, then he's probably like in Japan." And then I realized I was like, "Oh wait, no, this is in North Korea." And I was just very wrong on that regard. But it's
Fair.
like there's parts of that and like the puppet that, the performer had. I was like, "Oh boy. Oh." Like,
Yeah. Well, I
there's
mean, at the
small
same
things
time,
about it.
though, that's the kind of things they would do back then. Of like, that was acceptable to do at that time. So it's like, do you shrink away from it or do you embrace it? Or
No,
not
I think
embrace
that
is the right word, but acknowledge it.
yeah, and I think it was acknowledged. It's hard to tell with stuff like that, especially when it's like it doesn't affect me in the way that someone who else might be watching it might be like, yeah, ooh, that makes me uncomfortable. But like, that's it reflects also like the views of people from that time period as well.
Exactly. It'd be different if like they were doing all of that set in the modern day.
Right. It would be well, it was inappropriate then, but it's definitely inappropriate now. And it's like we
Exactly.
can
No,
we can look at it and acknowledge it and like look at the fact that it's also a story. Like
exactly. Yeah.
it probably didn't even happen that way.
Exactly. It's like the term is like the unreliable narrator, but it's
Mhm.
not. But typically, when that gets implemented, the unreliable narrator is usually when they're trying to like hide something or lie to you. This is more
Mhm.
of like it's just a guy who just wants to tell you a good story where there's
Right.
good, there's evil, and the guy gets the girl in the end.
Right, and that's kinda what makes this movie so wonderful is, like, I love the way that he told stories because it didn't even matter if you're like, "Oh, I totally believe this," because you're in the movie. Like, you're just watching this movie and you wanna see what happens, but the way that he tells these stories and how they're presented are just so brilliant, and
Mhm.
so I love the way that Tim Burton framed a lot of these because it was like they were wholesome at heart,
Yes.
and the scene with the giant and the circus when he's learning new things about this woman that he's in love with every day, and the werewolf, dude, let's talk about the werewolf.
I
I
understand.
was
That kinda comes at you out of in a movie with a lot of left field moments. That's, like, the most left field.
I mean, in all honesty, I thought something else entirely was happening when he first went up to his
So no, I think it's done that way on purpose. I gotta
I was like, "Is this about to be a very different movie?" And then a wolf popped out, and I was like, "Whoa." Like, that is not what I expected at all.
That's the best part, I think, with Tim Burton's name being in on it. You're just sitting there going, "Oh god, is this about to take a turn and become a real Tim Burton movie?"
And it always was a Tim Burton movie, but it was like it took the lighthearted elements of all the things that he loved to have in his movie and
Absolutely.
just amplified them in a way that told a wonderfully brilliant story that was kind of just sweet.
Yes, and I feel like that's the goal. It's not aiming to have, like, a grand moral. It's just meant to be a very sweet story that kinda just makes you feel better when it's over. And, of course, there's some little, like, one-liner jokes that when I saw it as a kid, it wasn't until I got older I understood, like, when, Danny DeVito I forget his name as his character name, but when he's looking at the giant, and he just looks at him and goes, "Do you know what involuntary servitude means?" And and he goes, "Nope." "Malicious contract?" "Nope." And he's like, "Sign here."
So funny, and there's so many small details throughout, like, all that movie, like, I'm also, like, really glad that the town that they filmed, Spectre in is actually still a place?
Oh, that's amazing.
Like, it's not an actual town, but it's an
Is it like a
abandoned
film
town.
town?
Yeah, it's like an abandoned prop, basically, that they still
Okay.
have everything up there, and I think people go and visit it every once in a while, but, like, unfortunately, I think the big main building in the back actually burned down in a fire, which is really sad. I had to look that
Oh,
up,
that's
but
unfortunate.
it is really sad, but it's cool that, they left it there, and, like, for Alabama, that was probably so cool for their film industry and for, like,
Oh, yeah.
tourism because they were just stoked. They're like, "Dude, movies are here." Like,
Yeah.
celebrities are in town, and they filmed that whole thing in Alabama.
Oh, yeah.
It was all filmed in location, and that's cool. That's probably, like, one of the beginnings of when, like, major Hollywood productions started to shift over to filming in the South.
That's true because like, that was in 2003, so that was definitely a novel concept at the time.
Right, it was, like, right before True Blood started filming in Louisiana, which if people don't know, that show is filmed almost entirely in Louisiana State.
Yeah, which nowadays, that's like, well, what's the big deal? But at the time, that was huge.
Right, and it's cool because you get a genuine feeling like you're like, "This isn't just a set, like, I'm in Alabama. I am
Yeah.
in his hometown where he grew up," and it's so fascinating, like, watching that, but, like, the way they use lighting in particular, like, what did you think about the lighting that they would use for, like, the different time period?
I loved it because it kinda gave them like, where you're talking about, like, a sweet or well, I said earlier about, like, with whimsical, and
Mhm.
I feel like I know it's a weird word, especially for, like, for a grown man to be saying, but it's to me, the perfect word that
Whim
you Huh?
I'm agreeing with you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I just at first I thought you said, like, something else, but anyway, with whimsical, it's like it's just I don't know, it felt like, it was almost like you're being told a really, really great bedtime story, and the lighting kinda gave it heightened like, it kinda just heightened everything where you're like, "Oh, this is definitely, like, almost like a dream" not dream well, when he was Inspector, it was kinda done like it was almost like a dream state because I get them being like, "Oh, maybe I'm looking too far into it." But I always thought it was like, "Oh, he had a near death experience." But, yeah, the lighting, I dug it with how they just it's almost like it helps show the difference when you're in the present day versus when you're being told a story. And it's really cool when you have that difference because even though obviously it jumps across decades, so it's pretty obvious when you're in a different time period just based on how people are dressed or how Edward Bloom himself looks. It's just like you're saying, adding little details like that to help. This is a completely different. almost like universe
Mhm.
from the present.
Yeah, it feels like a big, like, fairy tale that he's in, but well, I don't know if I should say fairy tale, but, like, it was like an American Tall Tale. It's
Yeah,
very, like it was very when he's in the past, it reminded me of, like, a Southern Gothic kind of aesthetic where there's moments of, like, "Ooh, that's kinda, like, freaky, that's a little frightening," but it's, like, this idea of, like, this fantastical world set in the American South, and when you brought up whimsical, like, whimsical is a perfect way to describe it.
yeah. And I'm a big sucker for the soundtrack too, because my parents, since they're children of the '60s, raised me on that music. So they if they listen to this, they would be probably a little upset if I didn't mention the soundtrack because
The soundtrack is great.
it's phenomenal. All the songs they picked perfectly fit with whatever was happening in the moment. Yeah, like I said, I think, and I know we're probably gonna jump around the movie in terms of like chronologically, but it's like at the end of the right at the end of the movie when the son is talking to the family doctor, and the family doctor tells him the real story of it, about his birth,
Mhm.
and he finds out like, oh, it was actually like kind of boring. And the doctor goes, yeah, and back in those days, the men were not allowed to be in the same room as the mother while she was giving birth. So it didn't change anything by him making this grand story. And he's like, so
That's
which one would you want? The boring story where he's like, oh, I stood outside for a few hours, or really amazing metaphorical story that kind of had a moral at the end of it about a guy trying to catch a big fish using his wedding ring.
yeah, I love that part of it, especially, like, when when we have the wedding scene with him, like, kinda, like he's the only one in there who's just like, "Oh gosh, like, I've heard this story a million times before,"
Hmm.
but everybody else is just completely entranced, like, even if they've
Yes.
heard it before, they're, like, looking at him, eyes fully locked on him, all that attention, and it's just so, like it was a small thing that I think, like well, it's obviously very obvious, but they don't linger on that, they linger on him and,
Hmm.
like, his control over that entire, like, story. Because I was immediately hooked after that.
Yes.
Like, I saw the big CGI catfish, and I was like, "Okay, interesting," and then, like, that scene was what really cemented it for me because I was already in, and then I was, like, in after that.
Yeah, because it really it did a great job of setting up what the big conflict that's gonna arc throughout the entire movie is.
Right,
And,
and
hmm? Go ahead.
another thing about this movie, like, with that arc specifically is, like, the bouncing between the 2 timelines. I've never had a problem with the movie's pace because it's a very slow-paced movie,
Mhm.
which normally would be, like, a strike for me because 'cause I'm not super big into, like if you're gonna do a slow pace, like, you have to do it right, and sometimes it's just not done well for
Yeah, it's a
me, in my
fine
opinion.
line, and if you don't do it well, people fall asleep.
Right, like, I'm mostly a screenwriter, so I'm kind of a stickler for pacing,
That's fair.
and that's just something like when I learned writing, like one of the things that I had like naturally locked in kind of just from years of doing it was like story pacing. And I feel like the story takes that and so because it's only 2 hours. Like
Mhm.
The Dark Knight feels like a very much quicker movie, even though it's like
2 and a
two
half.
it's I think it's 2 hours and 40 minutes almost.
Mhm.
And that's a long movie.
Yeah.
Like, that's a hard movie to, like, sit through for that long, but they make it easy because the pacing is just so brisk and quick, and this movie's different in that regard because it's much slower. It's not necessarily a slow burn, but it takes its time bringing these stories to life in a way that gives them development.
Yeah, and actually listening to you say that just made me think of something of, like, that shows the dynamic between Edward Bloom and his son, because Edward was a big fan of he didn't care if you rabbit trail. He's one of those guys that if you start talking to him, he's a guy that I will tell you the old saying of don't tell me how the watch was made, tell me what time it is. And he's very much he'll tell you not only how it got made, he'll tell you where every single piece was forged. He'll tell you what the band was made out of. He'll tell and he's really good at it. So like you talking about that, it's true because like the memories like and versus the present, it kind of was showing the pacing difference between the father and the son because the father obviously he was a big believer in taking his sweet time, and you saw that in the present day scene when Edward is lying in bed talking to I forget the son, like his wife, I forget her name, the French lady, um, but he's telling her a story of like a crow visited him when he was a kid and gave him nightmares of how, his dad was going to die.
Mhm.
And how his dad's like, and he goes, so his dad for like an entire day was just terrified because he found out pretty much whoever this crow told him in his dreams, if they say this person's going to die, they end up dying before the end of the day. So like his dad's sitting there like, and he just looks terrible at the end of the day because obviously he was waiting for death to come for him. And
Right.
he's like, I've had a bad day. And the wife just goes, oh, you think you've had a bad day? This morning, the milkman dropped dead. And the wife just starts laughing because she's like, because she was so like entrenched, like, oh my God, I'm about to hear this tragic story. And then realizes it was a joke the whole time.
Right. He's incredibly like charismatic too, which is like the actor they chose, Albert Finney.
Yes.
Um,
Brilliant.
he's so good in this, and he's so easy to develop like sympathy towards. Like his son, on the other hand, is like you can kind of understand where he's coming from, but he's a bit more flawed of a character. And I think that's why it was like so. I'm glad that they focused a lot of their time on like the young Edward Bloom
Yes.
because he's just so likable. He's so easy to follow, and his son is like, I don't want to say the antithesis because it's like you can tell he's a good man. He just wants the truth because he doesn't understand the joy of storytelling because he's not yet a father
Yes.
and the joy of life. And it's like, well, that's, bringing it back to like the idea of storytelling that you mentioned earlier. Like, in my opinion, storytelling makes everything better. Like
Agreed.
sometimes, unless you like have to tell the truth. Like if you're
If you're talking to a cop,
Edward Bloom would be the worst person to have to testify.
yeah, at
Because
that point, short and succinct is key.
he would be telling this grand old story and they'd be like, that is completely impossible. And he's like, oh, yeah? Well, back when I was in Alabama fishing for the big fish, or
They're
like
like, oh,
back when I fought a werewolf, and they're like, oh, God. They're like,
oh,
this
he's doing
guy,
it again.
get him off the stand. You have like a guy in the back who like shoots him with a blow dart.
Get him down. Your
Like,
Honor,
get
I'm
him off.
sorry for bringing him up here. No, but
Well,
no, I agree with you. Like story, and that's the big thing. Like it was also interesting too that it's like everyone understood except the son
mhm,
about the importance of storytelling. Even the wife understood it.
mhm.
Because like when you finally saw and I know like you talked about with the romance thing, it was a little stalkerish, though I will defend that, saying, unlike a lot of movies where a guy wants to marry a girl who's already spoken for,
Mhm.
they magically make a guy who was good, suddenly they write him to be bad, so you feel no sympathy when he loses. The guy that she was engaged to was written as a jerk from the beginning.
Funny little segue here. I'm pretty sure that he was also in The Office.
Potentially. There's a good
And
chance.
I think he was
Oh,
Pam's
was he?
fiance. He was Pam's fiance. Oh my god, I was trying to figure out oh, that's so funny. He played a engaged man, and then Jim comes along and ruins everything. And it's so funny. They're like, "Hey, do you want this new role?" He's like, "Yeah, what's it like?" And they're like, "Well, you don't have to change a whole lot." Like,
Yeah, and don't like, are people at least gonna be sympathetic for me because I'm a good guy? It's like, no, you're a real piece of crap.
no, bro, they're gonna hate you.
Yeah, it's like you are literally you are the sole reason that's keeping the woman from having true happiness. So have fun with that.
You're the villain of the story. Have fun. And he's like, "Oh,
Yeah,
great." Right. Well, he was also like, it's funny. He was the dad in I want to say he was in Brightburn. Have you seen Brightburn?
yes, I have.
I think he was the dad too.
Wait, was that him?
I think so. I have to look it up right now.
Go
But
for it.
like
No, no, I'll keep talking while you look that up then. Uh,
I'm pretty sure that's him because it's him. It's him. It's
oh my
100% him.
god.
Oh my gosh. Don
Well,
is Don something. Let me double
good.
check really
Well,
quickly.
hey, I'm glad the guy still gets work. Good for him.
David Denman is his name. David
Okay.
Denman is the actor. So he was in that. He was in The Office, and then he was also in Brightburn.
Oh my lord. The
What a
fact
collection! What a
that
filmography!
I know they'll say, what a range. Like no one could ever say he can't play range.
That's true, but they'll be like,
But
"Oh, but you were the same character in like in Big Fish and The Office," and he's like, "Shut up."
yeah, it's like
Like,
sorry, look, that's how Hollywood works. Back off. But
Mhm.
like I said, that's why I defend that a little bit because like to be like a Boy Scout and for convenience of plot, we're going to take the girl away from you. I've always been a sucker for that scene when she opens the window and he's standing out there in the field of flowers.
Oh, it's such a beautiful shot.
I know it's just like my heart just every. I'm like I'm not really. I'm a bit of a cheesy romantic, but not really. But every time I see that shot, I'm just like, oh.
Yeah, it's
uh,
it's beautiful, and, like, I saw it, like, when I first watched it again, like, for the first time, I was like, "Wow." Like, just the use
hmm
of color, it's like, it's impossible that he, like, made that happen somehow, but, like, just the idea behind it and the image that it created is just so beautiful because it's, like, representative of how much he loves her.
Oh yeah, like this is how much work he's willing to put in,
It's like,
and
"I've
she's
known you for 2 weeks, and I'm gonna plant an entire field of daffodils."
yeah, and no, then that's why I like the part of the reason why I'll defend it is because she has that they address in the dialogue where she goes, "Why would you do all this?" And he's like, "Because I love you." She's like, "You don't even know me." And he has the perfect rebuttal of like, "And I have my whole life to find out."
And that worked. That
I was like, "I think
somehow
I'm in
that
love."
worked. And she was like, "You know what? You're right."
Oh, I think what helped too was that follow-up thing when the guy was like, "Crap out of me." She's like, "Don't hurt."
Yeah, and he's like,
Okay.
"I won't," and then he just got rocked. He probably got punched like 20 times.
Well, yeah, when you see him like when he's bandaged up in the hospital, like in case you're curious of how bad of a beating he took, that's how bad it was.
It was so funny. I was watching, I was like, "Oh my gosh, they're gonna linger on this." It's almost cartoonish.
Yeah, which I get that, and I love that they play the line with it. Like we said at the beginning, Dark Knight, Big Fish, very emotional experiences, but get there in very different ways. But just like Dark Knight had to take like comic book stuff but ground them, Big Fish was constantly like taking stuff like almost becoming cartoony, but still staying within a grounded reality.
Right, like, the story, like, I guess, like, I don't wanna say subplot, but the plot of, like, him reconnecting with his son, like, I always felt rooted in that world, but there were times where I wished that, that world also had the magic of the world that he was telling, like, the
Right.
stories that he was describing.
Yeah, and I agree. And of course, it just has the moments that are just hilarious when Edward's in Texas to go just do a normal bank transfer. And Steve Buscemi's like, "Hey," the poet, and he's like, "What are you doing here?" "Well, I'm robbing this bank." "Wait, what?"
And he's like, "Hey, I need your help," and he's just like, "Alright, whatever." He's just went
I just look
along
at the
with
woman's like,
it.
"I am so sorry."
It's like Robert Greer's like, "Sorry, sorry, sorry," and the fact that they didn't have any money made it way funnier.
Exactly. I know the best part too is when it gets to the point where he basically explains like bad loan and lending practices and how that can screw over economies and banks.
Oh god, it's so, like
And
that was some biting satire that I was not expecting.
exactly. Especially because like I'm sure that was in the books. I know Big Fish started as a book originally. So I haven't
Mhm.
read the book itself, so I don't know like what was left in, what was taken out. But that was one of those like I don't know if that was in the books. If it wasn't, that seems rather appropriate that right after because 2003, so that wasn't very long after Enron. So it's like you said, very biting satire that was very tiny.
Mhm.
And of course, when the poet just sits there and goes, "Well, I need to go to Wall Street. That's where the true crime is."
He makes all that money, and I was like,
Yeah,
I hate it when he's right."
I know that's the best part. Like they don't even, like you said, they don't linger on it at all. Of like they just show a scene where it's like he's in New York talking to him. And they just make it very. He's been super successful. You don't know how successful, but you just know very.
And it's super, like, reflective of, like, the dad's humor, of, like, Edward's humor, like, it's dashed in there, but it doesn't make that story entirely about that. It just supplements this idea of, like, you take the real world things, but you make them funny and palatable for the fantastical story that he's telling. Speaking of fantastical, I loved when he tried talking about the iceberg being dragged to Texas for drinking water, and there was a woolly mammoth in it, which, number 1, it's hilarious. Number 2, I've been in Texas for almost 2 years now, and I can tell you there's no way that they were able to, 1, pull that across, like, I was like, "Yeah, no, that guy's never been to Texas." When he said that he's been to Texas, that man lied to your face. He
I know
he
that
has
that's
never he probably went in the winter when it's freezing cold. It's like the whole of Texas is like, wow, it's really chilly, but Houston's like super, super muggy.
Yeah. I mean, he wasn't in the part in Texas where there would be snow. He was like in the part, like, especially when you say like West Texas where I grew up. I'm like, no, no.
This is not possible,
You
buddy.
get like a week of winter, but you would not get an iceberg.
I'm literally nitpicking a tall tale as if it's a real
No, no,
story.
no. But that's the thing. That's the great thing is like if you start thinking that way, it's almost like the movie's purposely trying to like bait you into thinking like the sun.
Right? Like I just ignored the mammoth and then I was like, they wouldn't be able to pull that. It's too hot there.
Yeah,
Like
like
the water's too warm.
that's where you draw the line, not all
Yeah,
the other
Austin,
stuff.
not the mammoth, like a Scooby-Doo villain.
Exactly. Or like when they cut him off because he was trying to tell that story about like a car at a dealership that got covered in honey and flies stuck to it and flew off with it. And you're just like, he's BSing. But then I loved how they because they spend probably I'd say well over half the movie just going back and forth between present and the past.
Mhm.
And you're told at the very beginning most of this is probably a lie. So, like I said, the whole unreliable narrator. Oh, pardon me. But but then there's that moment when they go to the shed, like where his office is, to like start cleaning stuff out. Because for those that haven't seen it, the father has cancer, and it's not if but when. So they're trying to get everything in order before he passes. When they're in the office, Edward's wife, the son, so the mother, she finds the letter from the army that they had given her when they thought he had died.
Mm.
And she found it. And the son actually goes, "Wait, that actually happened?"
Right. And his wife looks at him. She's like, yeah, told you so.
Exactly.
Kind of shoots him that look.
Yeah. And even his mom was like, "Not everything your father says is a fabrication."
Right. Which is like, she never once interjected. Like, he'd basically be like bullying his dad. He's like, tell me the truth. Tell me the truth. Don't lie to me no more. Tell me, don't make a fool out of me,
Yeah,
man.
basically.
And the mom's just like, oh, I guess I'm gonna go make some more cookies. And like just like leave. She's like, screw this.
Yeah. Well, because I mean, the other thing too about Edward, and they really, especially when they're going through his past, like driving the point home of he is a prideful man that when he has his mind set on something, he is not giving it up. Especially the couple of times where like, a normal, decent man uh, would walk away from the situation, realize the battle's been lost, and only a fool would keep fighting. Well, I've always been a fool. And you're
Oh,
like,
it's so
dang
good.
it.
Like I want to get behind that because it's like, man, that's so probably not practical in real life, but I also love it. Like,
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely that situation of like the son after his wife find out about like how his father and mother met and got married. She's like, "Well, why didn't you ever tell me about that?" And he's like, "'Cause it didn't happen like that." And she's like, "But his version's so much more romantic."
yeah, I prefer that version.
Yeah, that's why even later on, everyone's always looking at him going, "There's nothing wrong with these." Like, he's not blatantly lying. The main points are correct. It's the
He's
details he fudges.
It's like you take cursive and then like you put like the little hearts or the flower on like the dots on the eyes.
Yeah,
Like
go the
it's
extra
kind of
mile.
like that. Yeah, like he's going overboard because that's just who he is as a person. And it's like, that everything he say is a load of bollocks, for lack of a better way to
Yeah.
put it. Like the whole giant story and like how he was living in a cave and like eating
Mhm.
sheep and like I knew instantly. I was like, is that Paul Bunyan? Like, is he about are we about to fight Paul Bunyan? It's been so long since I watched it that I was like, is there a fight scene in this movie that I just forgot about?
Oh, jeez. Probably my favorite part, well, we'll get to the tear jerking part probably in a minute, but because this is a movie that, like, we're talking about and you're listening, you're just like, "Wow, it's such a whimsical movie. Why were you talking about emotions?" Because it freaking punches you in the gut at the end, and it keeps punching you even when you're on the ground saying, "Stop," and it's like, "No, we're not done yet."
It just kicks you. Like it takes the to quote the Dark Knight, well not quote it, but to take from the Dark Knight when he like is kicking Batman and then he like has like the shoe knife and he just kicks him a couple times with that. That's basically what this movie does to your heart.
But it's that situation of like it hurts so good. I think my favorite, obviously I love the movie itself, but like I think my favorite part is at the very end when they're at I mean, spoiler for a movie that's even older than Dark Knight, that's at this point 17 years old. But the father dies, and at the funeral, the son is shocked of how many people from his stories actually show up. And you see Danny DeVito, and he has the cane that makes it seem like maybe he's not as, maybe he is in charge of a circus or at least of something. And you see the giant. Now he's not 10 feet tall, but he's
It's
head and
huge.
shoulders taller than everybody else. Yeah, he's huge. Um, you meet the twins, and you find out they're not conjoined, they're just twins. Uh, and that's when the son actually started realizing kind of like what his mom had told him. He was telling the truth more often than he was lying. Like he didn't lie about the people he met. He maybe just fudged the details of like their personalities, attributes, but
I
they're all
mean,
real.
maybe is a strong word to use. He didn't maybe exaggerate.
I know, but like I said, like, but you found out like he didn't just make people up. Like he would exaggerate and straight up lie about maybe like, for instance, like like the twins. They weren't literally conjoined. They were two people that helped him legitimately, and it was just such a touching moment to see all the people that showed up
It was
to the
really sweet.
funeral. Yeah, to know like he really made this huge impact in so many people's lives. And I will say the thing that I did enjoy, that I'm glad, well, not enjoy, but like I'm glad they addressed, was the son was convinced that his father Edward had cheated on his mother, because he's such a personable guy. He was always flirting with women, so surely he had an affair or two, maybe even like a secret family. And then when he goes back to Spectre and talks to well, she's now fully grown, but the little girl that was there, and she explains to him, he's like, no, because he's like, your father, he's like, to your father, there was only two women to him. There was your mother, and then everybody else.
Great
And
line. That's such a great line.
exactly, and that's why when she explained, like when she was telling, and I loved how they did that. Sometimes the narrator was a different person,
Mhm.
and when she was telling the story, she was like, yeah, and then when he left Spectre, the house that he fixed, it grew old and decrepit, and she became a witch. And the son goes, that doesn't logically make sense. He met the witch when he was a child. So how could you become that now when he's full grown? And she's like, well, in his head, it makes sense because it's not your mother. So,
Right. He kinda just applies, like, kinda copy paste some elements of that story. Plus, like, the way she told that story was absolutely amazing.
mhm,
It was almost as good as, like, every other story he told, but it was from her perspective, and, like, it kinda like the magic rubbed off, like, because she admired him so much
yes,
as a person because he was not only, like, one, just doing so many good things, but he was also a good man, and
yes,
having her, like, see him in this light and the reveal that, he was the good man that he had always been, that, everyone had thought him to be that whole time,
yeah. There was
and
no facade, which I think is, especially with the way like a lot of movies tend to go nowadays, and just I guess I could say the last 20 years. We're always taught that if someone is too good to be true, it's because they are.
right,
That
but not this man.
exactly. What you see is what you're getting. He doesn't have some secret like horrific crime that he's trying to hide or cover up or anything like that. Like, and it's almost unbelievable because you're like, there people this genuine don't exist, and it's like, yeah, he's right there.
Well, genuine's a strong word. We're talking about a guy who literally was talking about, like, wrangling a giant fish
Well,
and,
no, I
like,
meant like genuine in terms of like,
yeah,
uh,
no, 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 like, genuine in terms of, like, the emotion and their intention.
yeah, yeah. He's not lying. He's not gonna stab you in the back. He's not gonna, what's the phrase of like, he doesn't talk out of both sides of his mouth.
Right, right, and I love that about him because it's just such an easy character to follow. Like, I know I probably mentioned that, like, 3 or 4 times, like, he's so easy to like. It's true, though.
And oh yeah, you will be if you're. I will have to seriously question you if like after. you're 10 minutes into the movie and you're not like on board and like cheering for Edward Bloom, I'm gonna have to ask you what is wrong with you.
Exactly. Let's talk about the ending, honestly. Like,
Yes,
let's
yes.
go
I just
ahead.
want because once
Yeah,
you talk about that and it starts getting emotional, that's why I wanted to wait. But yes, let's get to that.
yeah. Let's in conclusion of like the exploration of this movie, that ending had me crying so hard.
Yeah,
Like, it
and
was
just to walk
huge.
people through it, like the father, Edward Bloom, and it's not too long after him and his son have a pretty. I mean, it's not like they're not like screaming at each other, but it's about as intense of an argument as you literally dying of cancer.
Yeah.
Uh, but he gets a phone call. Well, not phone, he gets home from running an errand, and when he sees the house empty, he finds out, oh, his father had a stroke, and he's now, on his last legs. They don't say as much, but and part of what I like about this movie is even though there is a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of things that get easily explained through just body language and like setting. The son's sitting there with his dad, and at the beginning of the movie, his dad got to see the witch, and the witch had a glass eye that showed you how you're supposed to die. So his father the whole time was saying, "This isn't how I die. The way I die is a surprise." Trying not to get emotional. I cried like a baby when I
Oh,
saw
I
this just a
know.
couple of days. So I'm trying not to get there. I'm like, gotta hold it in. Uh, I can cry when we go off air. Uh, they're sitting there, and the father kind of wakes up a little bit, and the son who stayed behind to watch him, the father just says, "Tell me how this ends." And the son just looks at him and goes, I can't tell stories like you can." And the father's like, "Yes, you can." Or he doesn't quite say because obviously he's struggling to speak, but he's like, but he basically saying like, "Yes, you can."
I think it was what he was saying was like from an earlier line in the movie when he's like, "But you haven't told me that part yet. How does it go?" And
That's
he's
right.
like this. And I was just like, "Oh God, this is it."
Yes.
Like,
Yeah, yeah.
oh man.
That's right. And because he's like, so because the son eventually is like, okay, I gotta tell this story then. So he's like, help me out. How does it just tell me at least how it starts? And that's the father goes, like this. And the son
So
starts telling this story. You're kind of right there with him because he's trying not to break down
mhm.
while he's telling the story, and you kind of feel the same way. Because his father kept saying, like, take me to the river. Because it's kind of been a theme throughout, is that like he would either get like lost in the rain, or he'd have to swim across a river or whatever. So he's like, that's where he needs to go be laid to rest. And so he tells the son tells this fantastic story about his father being laid to rest at the river. He gets to see everybody, and it's just this gut punch after gut punch because it's a juxtaposition of the son is trying to tell the best story he can, and you get told that he is a storyteller because his father goes, "You just write yours down." So he's telling the story as best he can, and it's being whimsical again. Like the bright lighting kicks back up. It's like it's like the merging of the past and present. The whole time you're just like sad because you're like, this is the final story. He puts him down the river and tells him, "You become the big fish," because he goes like, "That's what you've always been."
Mm.
And right when he finishes, his father literally, like right when he finishes the story, passes away. I can't remember. I know he says something about like, that's a good story, or he says, I can't remember the exact line, but he says something to a son that he did a good job, and then passes away. Yeah, it is a gut punch after gut punch of just like, oh, and the whole time, and like you're trying to sit there, not try not to cry while you're seeing all this like happiness and like we're back to whimsy and whimsical again, and you're just like, but why am I wanting to cry?
It was so like I remember like I was tearing up a little bit throughout like the whole car chase and the driving through traffic and then the giant appearing out of nowhere and like flipping over cars. Like
Yeah.
I was like laughing through tears. And then when they got to the river and everyone's waiting for oh God, I started bawling.
Yes, it
I
was
was just unable to keep it together.
it's such a good and it was just such a good send off for a guy that loved to tell stories, and like especially throughout the movie that you've been introduced to all these amazing strange characters. Like, and if you think it's weird that we barely touched on the werewolf, it's like, well, that's how many strange characters are in this movie. The werewolf is only a small part of it.
Oh
Uh,
god. I was crying like the clown that was, like, getting the silver bullet ready to shoot him. That was
yes.
so funny.
Yeah,
He's just loading the gun, and he has tears pouring down his face. I was like, "What?" That's I can't believe we didn't talk about that earlier. That's so funny.
well, because that's just how the movie you get. It's one of those like it's one of those like if you I don't know what to do if like after explaining this to you at long form like we have. If you don't have a desire to see this movie, I don't know what to tell you. But it is one of those movies where like you might need to watch it a second time because once you watch it the first time and the second time you can help catch all those things like of like, oh, this moment just happened. Like you said, like clown with the silver bullet about to kill a werewolf and he's crying because he doesn't want to do it. And you're like, wait, this is hilarious and sad at the same time. And uh the movie just hits you with all that like quickly and just moves on. And you're like, wait, are we gonna talk about that? Nope.
Yeah,
And
if this movie doesn't affect you emotionally, then you need some soup to warm up your cold, dead heart.
yeah, I don't know what life has done to you to beat you down, but I'm so sorry. Uh
It's so good though, dude. I'm really glad that, this was what we chose to talk about because ooh-wee. Oh,
yes.
man.
Oh man. That's like I said, to kind of like I guess put a little bow on it because I know we've said about everything we can to say without just starting to, ramble and repeat ourselves. The movie will always ring very close to my own heart. Like I said, just because of the dynamic of I have a father who tells a lot of tall tales of where you're sitting there like, I don't know how much of this is real. And then you realize, oh, more of it's real than you realize. You're like, oh, what kind of crazy life have you had? So to see a movie that so perfectly encapsulated that, and it wasn't trying to be like edgy or trying to be like, oh, but we're going to teach you this weird moral, or we're just for the purpose of throwing you off, we're going to suddenly make the main character a bad person. It just, like I said, I mean, fairy tale is, it sounds inaccurate, but like an American tall tale, legend, myth, whatever. It's almost like Edward Bloom, the man, the myth, the legend.
And
And it's like, you might think, oh, that means it's all lies. It's like, no, that's the only way to describe him.
yeah,
And
it's really wholesome and it's just really like it's one of those movies that like I've developed a fondness for so significantly since I last watched it. And
yeah.
oh my, I'm so glad you recommended this.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I'll always have a special place for it. And yeah, that is why I like Big Fish. And that's why it is my favorite. And if you ever ask me, there's a couple of other movies I will always throw up as like kind of like a 1B, 1C, but Big Fish will always be right there.
It's a good one. And I hope that, if you guys end up watching that movie, which you absolutely should, even if you've already seen it, I think that if you can take away the joy of storytelling from that and it just warms your heart like it warmed mine, then I'm really pleased that you were able to get that from that movie. And honestly, just keep watching movies. And we're really glad that we got to talk about these movies today. I got to talk about my favorite movie, The Dark Knight. And obviously, we just finished talking about Big Fish, but like, it's just been so great to like introduce these movies to you guys, movies that you've probably already seen, but now you get to hear people talk about it. And I'm really excited to talk about more movies on the future.
Oh yeah. And of course, if you have any like comments or anything you want to say of uh, agree, disagree, whatever, uh, we're more than happy to hear because as much as we do like talking about movies as well, we want to obviously hear from y'all as well of your thoughts.
Absolutely. Please do let us know. Like, give us some feedback on this podcast that you guys have been listening to. Hopefully, you're all still listening. If you've left, I'm really sorry we scared you away, but we're really
Well, if
glad to have
after
you guys.
yeah, if after this, now that we've done a bit of a long form, hopefully this kind of gives you an idea of how we like the perspective we come from when it comes to movies at least, like what we look for and how we break things down. So if we can do that and help you develop a love of movies, then I believe I can at least say I've done my job.
And we want to talk about this more. So hopefully, you guys can like this and share this and introduce your friends to this podcast. And we want to keep making new content for you guys. We're going to be talking about more movies. We're going to be talking about wrestling. We're going to be talking about comic books and superheroes, all the above. And we really hope you guys stay tuned. But thank you for joining us for our debut podcast. I had a lot of fun talking about these movies, and Caleb, I hope you did too.
Oh, it was absolutely a blast.
Yeah, well, join us next time when we come to you guys with some new movies, and we look forward to hearing from you guys. And yeah, join us soon. This has been a lot of fun. And Caleb, would you like anything that you would like to say?
Just be on the lookout because we're going to cover quite a bit of ground on all sorts of stuff, and it'll be fun. And I look forward to seeing what y'all think about it. So please join us.
Join us, you guys. Thank you so much, and we look forward to having you back.
All right. See you later, guys.